The United States Navy spent billions of dollars trying to solve one of the most dangerous choke points on Earth and failed. Then, an aircraft built in the 1970s, designed to kill Soviet tanks, walked in and did the job in a way no one expected. This is not a story about old technology. This is a story about money, strategy, and the kind of military truth that governments prefer you never figure out. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, 21 miles, and through those 21 miles flows roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply every single day. That is not a statistic, that is leverage. Raw, brutal economic leverage, and Iran knows it better than anyone. For decades, the U.S. Navy has poured resources into carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, and next-generation frigates, all designed to project overwhelming force across open ocean. But the Strait of Hormuz is not open ocean. It is a narrow, shallow, cluttered kill zone, filled with islands, coastal missile batteries, swarm boats, and underwater mines. And in that environment, a $100 billion carrier group suddenly becomes something that military planners hate to admit, a target. Iran's strategy was not to match American naval power. That would be suicidal, and they knew it. Their strategy was to make the cost of any confrontation so unpredictable, so economically catastrophic that the United States would hesitate. And hesitation in a crisis is almost as good as winning. They built fast attack boats by the hundreds. They developed anti-ship ballistic missiles. They placed coastal defense systems across the entire northern coastline of the Gulf. They practiced swarming tactics, dozens of small, fast, cheap boats attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. Against a destroyer or a cruiser, this is a nightmare scenario. The math simply does not work in the Navy's favor when you are trying to track and intercept 20 or 30 small boats moving at speed in shallow water with islands and radar clutter everywhere. The Navy tried. They ran exercises, they developed counter-swarm protocols, they deployed helicopters and patrol boats, but the vulnerability was structural. You cannot fully defend a carrier strike group against a well-executed swarm attack in a confined waterway, not without accepting enormous risk, and the financial consequences of losing even one major naval asset in the Strait of Hormuz would send oil markets into a spiral that would make the 2008 financial crisis look manageable. That is the context you need to understand what happened next. The A-10 Warthog was never supposed to be a naval asset. It was designed during the Cold War to fly low and slow over the European plains and tear apart Soviet armored columns. Its primary weapon is the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm rotary cannon that fires depleted uranium rounds at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. It was built to be ugly, brutally effective, and almost impossible to kill. It has more titanium armor around its cockpit than most people realize. It can fly with one engine destroyed, one tail section gone, and still get its pilot home. The Air Force tried to retire it multiple times. Every single time, the people who had actually been in combat begged them not to, because in close air support, nothing does what the A-10 does. Nothing. But what changed in the Hormuz scenario was not just what the A-10 could do. It was what it could do that everything else could not. Here is the critical insight that most analysts miss. Swarm tactics work against large, expensive platforms that cannot afford to engage every single target individually. A destroyer firing missiles at small boats is burning $2 million interceptors to kill a boat that cost $50,000. That math destroys your budget before it destroys the enemy. Iran understood this asymmetry perfectly. They built their entire Gulf strategy around it. The A-10 changes that equation completely. When you put A-10s over the Strait of Hormuz, the math inverts. Each 30mm round costs approximately $30. $30. An A-10 can engage dozens of small surface targets in a single pass. It can fly low enough to visually acquire and distinguish between threat and non-threat.
It can loiter over the battle area for hours, something a supersonic jet simply cannot do. It can take catastrophic damage and keep flying, and critically, it can operate without relying on the complex network of radar systems and electronic infrastructure that Iran has spent years figuring out how to jam and deceive. The A-10 is analog in the best possible sense. It sees with its eyes, it fires with a gun, and in the chaos of a swarm attack in a narrow strait, that simplicity is a strategic advantage worth more than any software update. But this is WarFinex, and we do not stop at the military layer, because behind every weapons decision is a money decision, and the financial dimensions of this story are where it gets truly extraordinary. Let's talk about what a Hormuz closure actually costs the global economy. Analysts at J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs have run these numbers. A sustained 2-week closure of the Strait of Hormuz would send oil prices to somewhere between $150 and $200 per barrel, potentially higher depending on strategic reserve deployments. That triggers inflation across every economy on Earth that imports energy. It accelerates recessions in Europe and Asia. It strains government budgets. It destroys consumer purchasing power. And it hands enormous leverage to every oil-producing nation that is not in the Gulf, Russia, Venezuela, and others who would benefit enormously from a sustained price spike. In other words, a successful Iranian interdiction of Hormuz is not just a military victory, it's an economic weapon pointed at the entire Western world. And the cost of preventing that scenario drives defense budget decisions worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, here's where the A-10 story intersects with the money flow in ways that should make you pay very close attention. The defense industry lobby has been pushing for the A-10's retirement for over a decade, not because it doesn't work, it works exceptionally well, but because retiring it creates procurement space for far more expensive replacement programs. The F-35 costs roughly $80 million per aircraft. The A-10, with full depot-level overhaul, can be kept operational for a fraction of that. When you're talking about a fleet of dozens or hundreds of aircraft, the difference is measured in tens of billions of dollars. That money doesn't disappear when a program gets canceled. It gets reallocated, and the companies positioned to receive those reallocation contracts have spent considerable resources ensuring that the retirement conversation stays alive. This is the hidden financial current beneath the surface of what looks like a purely military debate. But something unexpected happened. Combat experience in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria kept proving the A-10's irreplaceable value in exactly the kind of irregular, contested environments where swarm tactics and cheap asymmetric weapons are used. Pilots came back with mission reports that made retirement arguments politically impossible to sustain. And then, the Hormuz threat matrix evolved in exactly the direction that made the A-10's specific capabilities more valuable, not less. The aircraft that the industry wanted to retire turns out to be the aircraft that solves the Navy's most persistent tactical problem in the most economically critical waterway on Earth. That's not an accident of history. That's a lesson in what happens when you let pure procurement logic override operational reality. Now let's go deeper into the geopolitical consequences, because the ripple effects of this dynamic extend far beyond the Gulf. China has been watching the Hormuz situation with extraordinary attention. China imports roughly 70% of its oil through the strait. Any disruption to Gulf shipping is not just an American problem, it's a Chinese economic crisis, and that creates an interesting strategic triangle. Iran holds leverage on both the United States and China simultaneously. Managing that leverage and the responses it generates has become one of the most complex diplomatic puzzles of the 21st century. Russia, for its part, stands to gain economically from any sustained Hormuz disruption, while maintaining plausible deniability about its interest in such an outcome. Russian energy revenues increase when oil prices spike, and Russia has provided Iran with military technology that directly enhances Iran's ability to threaten Gulf shipping. The financial incentives are not subtle once you start following the money. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have their own deep concerns about Iranian power, have quietly engaged in conversations with the United States about basing arrangements and operational support that would facilitate exactly the kind of low-altitude close air support missions where the A-10 excels. The politics of that are complex, but the operational logic is straightforward. If you're going to defend Gulf shipping lanes against a swarm threat, you want A-10s on airfields close enough to reach the strait quickly, with enough fuel to loiter, engage, and return. The investments being made in airfield infrastructure across the Arabian Peninsula over the last few years tell a story that the official statements rarely do. Follow the construction contracts, the logistics deals, the pre-positioning agreements, and you see the shape of a strategy that has A-10 operations written into it, even when the briefings never mention the aircraft by name.